All right, so in the previous video, I just showed you how to essentially take advantage of the fact that RStudio is web aware and R has a plethora of resources for you to learn how to actually use this programming language in a way that's relatively intuitive. If you notice, we use drop-down menus, we use the graphical user interface, we used hyperlinks here, and as I said before, I mentioned these what are so-called cheat sheets, which you can print out yourself, you can read them over, and you can study them because they're actually quite detailed and they're colorful. And I'm going to show you that again, when you click on this RStudio cheat sheets link, it'll go to your default web browser, and you can see right here. Here we have the web browser. Looks like we have two tabs open. But I just want to show you that what we're going to focus on in this little video is, in this moment, is I'm scrolling down. This what they call the RStudio IDE cheat sheet. This is the cheat sheet for this environment right here. This is this is basically not necessarily base R, which is what we'll focus on later, but essentially the environment that you're working with, the graphical user interface, the so-called wrapper that sits on top of R. Because if you notice, there's actually quite a bit going on here. You have 4 panes that it looks like, but you also have some tabs. You have little buttons here. There's quite a bit. I have an R script file open, and that's essentially where you write your code, and we'll talk about that later. But there's also quite a bit of other stuff, and we're not going to go through all of it, but I'm just going to give you a taste or an idea of what's available. So we're going to actually move into this screen, just the PDF of the cheat sheet, and you can sort of get an idea of sort of the anatomy of a cheat sheet. What are they? Well, essentially, this is actually 2 sheets. The second page is in color. And basically consists of a plethora of keyboard shortcuts, either for Macintosh or for Windows. And I often, if you're using R quite a bit, which I hope you do, you'll get into the habit of actually using a lot of these keyboard shortcuts. And I try not to do it too often if I'm doing a little tutorial like this. But I want to start with this first page. This first page is quite busy, but it starts off with something that is should be quite familiar, which is this square right here. This is essentially your environment right here. And if we just take a few steps back, I want to remind you that essentially RStudio has 2 different versions. It has a free version that we're using, but it also has what they call the Pro version, or the Pro feature version. And that's essentially, it has more capacity. It lets you do different kinds of parallel projects. It does cost some, but it's well worth it. But I want to remind you that we're not doing that. We're using the free version in this case. So this might seem like quite a bit, especially when you're starting out. I would recommend just starting off, taking a look at this. I'm zooming in actually right into the squares here. You can see that this is the anatomy of, if I can unhighlight this. Sorry about that. Hold on for a second. For some reason, this is the problem with sometimes using a Mac. It wants to just click on everything. Well, what I want to show here is if you look and zoom in on what we have in the main pane of the window, we actually have, I'm actually going to close and reopen that. I'm going to revert those changes. We're going to actually reopen that page. If you notice, it's essentially this right here. This is the core of RStudio. That is to say, it's essentially 4 windows that are pinned. By pinned, I mean, if you see me moving this, you see that my little arrow, mouse arrow here turns into like a little kind of a cross, and I can change the size of these. But I can't unpin these. If you know how to unpin these, then you are better than I am at this. But you can see there are a lot of options here. Look at this already. What's great about RStudio is that it communicates a lot with different kinds of languages, different types of markup languages, different types of scripting languages. And that's what this is here. This upper left-hand corner in my environment is, in my operating system is the where you write the code, essentially. This is the script right here. This is the recipe, I like to say. Your environment, that is what you put in your sandbox, or what it is that you create, is in this environment. It's called a global environment because whatever you put there is going to stay there. And there are some drop-down menus, and there's some history there, and some connections, and some other things that we can look at. But what's probably the most variable is going to be this, depending on your operating system, or depending on the version of R or RStudio, you might have different tabs here in the lower right-hand corner. But essentially, you have one that has files, so this is the location. If you look on my desktop, I have something that is just called my code, modestly, and that's where we're sitting right now. And here I have this little script file that's empty right now. And you have a plots pane. This is essentially when you make graphics, it'll open up here. I made the mistake when I first used R to actually fail to have a graphic open because I made the pane too small. But essentially, that's one of the I guess, if that happens to you, just make sure that you open the pane to be large enough. The third pane here has to do with the packages that you install. And packages are essentially the life. I always call it the lifeblood of R. It's, for some people, it might be a curse because there are an exponentially increasing number of packages, which a package is like they're akin to libraries in Python, but they're essentially written bundles of code and that are geared toward a particular task. And in R, you have to install a package, and then you also have to load a package. So installing a package means you have to connect to the internet and you put it on your computer, and then loading it means you're acquiring it for use in that particular session. Some of this might seem basic if you're used to object-oriented programming, which is to say you have things defined in your environment and you want to manipulate them. But it's important if you're more used to statistics using Excel or some of the major sort of the standard stats packages that kind of hide the object or the programming aspects of data analysis, such as Stata or SPSS. Sometimes it's a little bit less intuitive there. In fact, in SPSS, I'll often look to the end of the manual and they will actually say, oh, just invoke Python or R if you want to do something more interesting or complex. So I thought, well, why not just learn R? But essentially, you can install as many packages as you want. We have some here. I do some cluster analyses. We should have Mosaic here. This is one I install, and we can talk about that later. But essentially, you can install your packages, you can update them, you can click on them to load them. But packages is something we'll talk about later. Help, I talked about in the first video. But there's quite a few links here. You can spend all day here. You know, user manuals, FAQs, search engines, keywords, internals, lots of things here. The viewer here, we don't have to worry about as much, but essentially, we're going to focus more on the fact that you should get familiar with this idea that you have a script that you're going to open. In fact, if I close this, this is what R will look like. Because you want to actually realize that R fundamentally is, you don't have to write with any script, but it's always good to write down what you code, because you won't be able to remember it. So this is why we have our script. But you could write out anything, but that's why if you open a script file, it'll usually appear in the upper left-hand corner. Sometimes these things can change, but what will not change is the fact that you're kind of stuck. You're stuck in this window of these pinned windows, and that's essentially what the RStudio cheat sheet does. I know I'm kind of already dragging on in terms of explaining what's going on. I don't want to be too verbose, but just going back to this noisy cheat sheet, just pay attention to the fact that what's going on here is that you can write code in this upper left-hand corner, right? This is what they're talking about. They're bragging about this. You can see that in the console, this is what the lower left-hand corner is. The console essentially has different kinds of markup files. This is a PDF or a markdown file, which is simply a way of producing a document that integrates the code. And you can minimize these panes too. So it shows that you can minimize or maximize these panes. And that you can have different kinds of code file types. In programming languages, you'll often see the word foo as a placeholder for any kind of word. It's kind of the ipsum lorem ipsum of programming languages. You'll see foo here. And in R, I'm going to warn you, you're going to see this ubiquitous iris dataset. It is a famous dataset in I guess, biology, in evolutionary biology, but you're going to encounter it. It's sort of a default dataset. And R does include, base R includes datasets. But if you want to use an example, it's often easier or better to use an example using data that are familiar with you. And the iris dataset will be very familiar to you if it isn't already. So that's why they include it here. They talk a little bit about the environment. They call this the workspace. So the global environment, you could call it a workspace. I called it a sandbox. There are different ways to display objects as well. So, but think of your objects as occupying this workspace, this environment here, and they can have different. They'll fall into different categories here, which is nice when you use RStudio. So if you open what is called a data frame, that is something that's kind of like your standard Excel sheet. It'll open up here. Something that has like an atomic vector or has one value, it'll be here. Functions, which is essentially, if you revisit math, a function can be any kind of confabulation that you do, whatever you do to something, whatever complex manipulation of x that you do. That function is also displayed differently. It's separated out in your environment, which is kind of handy. In the lower right-hand corner, it kind of explains in detail what each of these buttons do. You can create a folder, upload folders, you can delete files, you can rename files. You can even change the directory. So that's the location that you're placing your analysis. But the main point is you can do all of this using drag and drop, the drag and drop menu. And I haven't even left, by the way, these pinned, windows here. So just keep in mind you have four parts here, right? So you have in the left-hand corner, you have the script or the code, essentially. In the lower left-hand corner, you have the console, and that's closest to what base R would look like. And then up in the right-hand corner here, you have the environment that displays your objects that you define. If that is a little counterintuitive to you because you're not used to programming, that's okay. In the lower right-hand corner, you have a various number of tabs that show packages, plots, help, and other kinds of a viewer that essentially can show you where you're located. It can help you navigate within the environment. All of these features are available. If you look at these other kinds of what they talk about here in terms of these other aspects of using R, such as version control, debugging functions. You can write packages, and also talks about some of the details here in the panes here. But essentially, I just want to illustrate that using this cheat sheet is very helpful, and that there's quite a bit here. But the good start is just to kind of familiarize yourself with these aspects right here. Okay, we're going to get started with base R now, and that's enough of this. We'll get back to it using RStudio, but I think it's really important just to get an idea of your environment right here. All right, thank you very much.